Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Jawad and Arab Advisors for the kind invitation to come and talk to you today. I'm not an ICT person. I am an urban planner, and I think coming after Ziad, talking about smart cities, and I've sat here for 2 days listening about the smart home and the smart city, and I couldn't help thinking they're lovely concepts. We are probably, I think, in my opinion, as a planner, as somebody who works in cities on a day-to-day basis in this part of the world, we're probably years away, I think, to try and answer, I think, the question that Peter posed. There's an issue with data. Data is not shared, and without the sharing of data, without open data from cities, from municipalities, from government, from telecoms operators, you cannot run and operate smart cities. It's as simple as that. It all comes down to data. And we're talking smart cities beyond smart homes, beyond 5 or 6 homes somewhere in Amman that are connected to the internet. These are prototypes. Actually, you want to mainstream all of these processes. So what I'll talk to you today is just a little experiment we're doing in the south of England, working with data to try and map a simple thing, which is bicycle lanes in a city. Okay, and we're using the city of Brighton as an example to just show you the potential of some of these things. And I wanted to start off by just looking at maps. So I've got a few maps to start with. This is an old city map, and I'll try and show you how our mapping of cities as urbanists has changed over the years. So this is a map from 1899. It's nearly 130 years old. It's Ebenezer Howard's Garden City map. And it links to concepts in the city related to walking, cycling, which I'll come on to in a second. This is an old map. This is a map from 1748. It's one of the first maps that drew a city in black and white, something most of us are used to today when we look at a street map. This is a space syntax map. This is from the late 80s, early 90s in England. It maps the way people move around a city. So the redder the lines, the more people move along a particular street axis. This is a Twitter map of London, and it shows you the amount of tweets that come from a specific location at any given point during the day. We know this information. We know most of the tweets are geotagged anyway. All you need is to be able to access the data, to then be able to draw up a map that show you where people move around the city and where the tweets are coming from. But in order to do this, you need to have open data. Something I think we still probably lack in this part of the world. Okay. This idea of predictive modeling, and I think that's probably one of the underlying assumptions behind the idea of a smart city. Can you use the data to predict behavior? And that's what I'm hoping to get to with this idea of mapping cyclists' movements around the city. Okay. Predictive analytics is one of these points. And the other question is, to what extent does larger data sets allow us to make better predictive models, i.e., is more data better for the quality of the predictive models that we are working with? Probably as urbanists or as researchers. Sorry, I'm just gonna take a sip. I'll come back to the third point here. We don't know the answer, but I think it's the third point on the screen. This idea of massive numbers is something that's useful, and that's where the quality of the data comes in, and that's where the numbers behind this idea called big data comes in the work of people who model people's behavior in cities, how people move around the city, why they move around the city, what's their starting point, what's their end point, in order to then be able to map movements and hopefully make cities function a little bit more efficiently. And we see that in Amman. We're coming to a point where the lack of public transport systems in Amman is actually making moving around this city quite an impossible task on a day-to-day basis. And I think we've come at a crucial point where the city has to act, but the city is unwilling to share its data with the people who can help it. And I think that's one of the crucial points in this discussion. Okay, I'll skip that. The other idea is this urban mobility idea, and what cities in let's say the northwestern part of Europe, and we're primarily talking cities in Holland, Danish cities are doing with the idea of mapping cyclists' movements around the city is twofold. It's the concept of the sustainable city on one side and the concept of the smart city on the other. By encouraging people to change their mode of transport from cars to bicycles, they encourage a sustainable way of living. By then encouraging a sustainable way of living, they're able to try and track a lot more easily the movement of primarily cyclists and pedestrians using things like Fitbits and mobile phones, and working with operators to try and open up the way people can then choose the way they move around cities. And we've heard examples of, I think, parking meters, for example. Most of Western Europe now pays its parking tariffs via text messages. Meters no longer take coins. It's about making things easier and simpler for people. And that's the idea of the livable city, and that's the idea of a better quality of life. It's that kind of open interaction between the city, the services, and the city itself that provides these services for the residents. So, rather than being stuck in one of these for 2 to 3 hours a day, you're more likely to be sitting in a free-flowing cycle lane, and I think this is where bigger lessons can be drawn up. In the case of Amman, in spite of all the history, fast, rapid transit system, rapid buses, and so on. Okay, it's about the infrastructure that's needed, and it's about the research that's then used to try and drive this infrastructure forward. And that's where the point becomes very important, this idea of sharing and opening up the data sets. I think this is probably more than anything else a call for people in Jordan and the audience across the Middle East is that they have to open up their data sets. The data sets are there, and we know they're there, but they're not opened up to the public, they're not opened up to research institutions, they're not opened up to universities. Universities probably can't be bothered to do research with big data, but they have to show interest in working with data, and they have to work with telecoms giants, but the telecoms giants have also got to show the willingness and the inclination to work with research institutions. It has to work both ways. It's not going to work if one party wants it. Okay, so that's the important agenda here, if there is a research agenda to be driven forward. And I'm thinking beyond the telecoms sector. And partly this idea of buy-in. You need to get the public interested. There's no point in talking about big data in a room like this. All of us know the usefulness and the implications of it. Actually, we need to get the outside world interested in this idea of big data. And for them to be interested, they need to see the impact on their daily lives. And they'll see the impact on their daily lives if the services that are offered to them improve. Okay? And the services that are offered to them will improve if the cities then share the information that will allow the lives of citizens to be improved. Going back to this idea of a smart city, but actually a smart city underpinned by a livable city and a sustainable city. And I think without a livable city and without a sustainable city, you will never achieve a smart city beyond a smart city of pockets. Okay? And I think we want more than a smart city of pockets. So this idea of cycle lanes, and cycling may not be such a favorite pastime in Jordan. It's a growing habit in most cities in the West. And cycle lanes tend to have their own, lanes. They're all drawn up. This is the two pictures you're looking at show the creation of two new cycle lanes in Brighton. This is from two months ago. And this is something that's been created not using the mapping techniques of seeing where cyclists go. This was done because the road was big enough and the city council, they had some government funding and they thought we're going to create cycle lanes. And the underpinning argument here is actually there's a lot more cleverer, if we can say that. Yeah, there's a more cleverer way of doing cycle lanes, simply by tracking where cyclists go. And when you track them, when you know where they start, when you know where they end their journeys, you can then design the cycle lanes to suit those journeys. That's the simple experiment. You're not simply doing the cycle lanes because you can, which is what the last two pictures showed you. You're actually doing them because you've tracked cyclists. You've got that data, okay? We're currently in the process of tracking 500 cyclists over a 8-week period, and just to see where they move, where they start their journeys, where they end, and we're going to use that data to then go to the city and say, your cycle lanes are in the wrong place. Okay? And that's what the implications of the use of the data in this case, are. And it works, as I've said before, on rapid bus routes. If you know where people move around the city, and you can track them because you've got their phones, you've got the data, the operators certainly have that data, they know where people are and how they're moving around the city, then you can actually plan your bus routes to suit those travel patterns. And then other people can work around those travel patterns, and you immediately begin to address what appears to be, on the face of it, a severe traffic congestion problem. It's not as complicated as it seems. The work we're doing will reduce delays for cyclists. If you apply the same concepts to buses and other modes of transport other than the car, then you can actually address the problems in the same way. You just need the infrastructure in place, and you need the infrastructure in the right place, more importantly. Okay. So this work, I said we've been tracking 500 cyclists. We've put GPS trackers on the bicycles. The data comes to a bunch of iPads. The data is then churned and stored, mapped onto the city's road network, and then that data, when we're finished working with it, probably at the end of August, is going to be passed on to the city to try and then help the city to try and redesign some of the cycle lanes and probably design new ones as well. And I think there is a general learning here, and the learning here is that this kind of infrastructure planning, using data-driven infrastructure planning, is actually the way forward, because then you can provide the infrastructure where it's most needed, not where you think it needs to go. And you can do the same with cars, you can do the same with buses. People counters, traffic counters, car counters, they're not a new invention. Everybody around the world uses that kind of information. And if you map that information alongside the data that you're getting from trackers and from people's phones, you get a much better idea of how people are moving around the city, and then you can target your services better. I can't make that point. I can't emphasize that point, I think, any more than that. It's all about the travel. It's about the travel choices, and you can map the travel choices by the data of people's handsets. And the second point says it all. It's about understanding and predicting how people make these choices. And in our case, it's about how cycle networks can be influenced. Influenced meaning designed and supplied to the city in order to make them more efficient, more safe, more sustainable, more user-friendly, and then ultimately, it's a long way away, create a smart city beyond the tag of a smart city, because you can't create smart cities overnight. So, linking urban data, and I think that's also important. Beyond the supply of open data, you need to then be able to link that data. And I can't tell you how we can do that. It's data from the operators, data from the cities, data from the government, which I know for a fact they're reluctant to share. And I think, the applications in Amman at least can be quite instantaneous. You can easily begin to address the city's transport infrastructure. Again, as I've said, it's not as difficult as it seems. You have the information about how people move around the city. The information is there. It just needs to be brought out into the open. So 3 key messages for you here, or maybe four. There is a methodology that allows us to then take advantage of this data and look at the travel patterns. We use it for cyclists, but like I said, you could use it for all sorts of modes of transport. You can use it for taxis, you can use it for cars, you can use it for buses. And that's the idea. This technology is there. It needs to be properly used, properly managed in order to assist route demand management. But for it to be able to assist route demand management, it needs to be open. The next step is this understanding of people's travel activity pattern. So you're actually using information which is research-based, and if you as a company, you can't do that, then, Jordan has dozens of universities, and I'm sure there are people out there who can actually help. There are a lot of clever people working in the universities without a lot of money and without a lot of data. And if you give them the data, they can actually do quite a lot with it. But that's the idea that sits behind this idea of a sustainable future. Again, beyond the tags, beyond the straplines, beyond this idea of, we're creating smart cities. Because again, creating smart cities takes a very long time. Again, as the Dutch will tell you, as the Germans will tell you, as the Danes will tell you, and these are people who are pioneering work on smart cities around the world. The English are investing right now, hundreds of thousands of pounds in research on big data, and we still haven't seen the implications of that for sustainable cities. We're a long way away from that, and smart cities as well. So, with a simple exercise, looking at trip origins, trip destinations, look at how people select routes, look at what happens when they start off on that route and how they change their behavior when they're on that route, you can actually then begin to understand the networks that happen in your cities. And that information is useful for urbanists, it's useful for city managers, it's useful for governments, and I'm sure ultimately it will be useful to the people who supply the data. I think there needs to be an element of patience on both sides, and travel patterns. This is a map of the cycling routes in Derbyshire County Council in the north, in the Midlands, in England. It's a very complicated system, but for you to be able to map real usage, I think it will show you a whole lot of new different patterns, and it will take us en route to creating smart cities. I think it will not get us there, but it will certainly put us in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samer. Now we'll open the floor for any questions from the audience. Okay, we have a question from the gentleman, the first row.
Ricardo Tavares from TechPolis. Well, thank you for your presentation, very insightful. I have actually two questions. One is, how do you see technology changing your profession of urban planning? And second, Hassan Habani from Grey Coats mentioned yesterday that most of the data is in the hands of governments and telecom operators, the useful data, for example, for urban planning. And many governments are actually seeing the value in creating sort of open data rules and even legislation that creates a flow, a natural flow of data in usable format. But how do you find, and we know there are problems there, but how do you find, is it easy to get data from telecom operators? Two questions.
Yep, sure. Let me start off with the second one, because it's a lot more simple, a lot simpler. You can access any kind of bit of data you want. If I need data for research purposes, then it comes with a certain proviso that I can only use it for academic purposes. I can only use it for research purposes. But then if I use data for research purposes, I have to show that actually I have made good use of that data, and there's actually a public benefit coming out of that data. And if I can show there is a public benefit, then there's a stronger case for me to access data. And sometimes the data is supplied for free, sometimes it's supplied with conditions, sometimes you pay for it. But ultimately, the access to the data is there. If you know, and most of the time, you know where the data set is, so you know who owns that particular bit of data. In terms of the first one, I think it's changing the profession a lot. It's one of the pictures showed a group of people walking around. That was the city of Rotterdam a couple of weeks ago, and it's one of the simplest things we use is an app, and it's called Field Trip GB. It's produced by the University of Edinburgh. And it's similar to the kind of, the walk meters app that actually, in addition to tell you how much calories you've spent, it actually shows you the route that you've walked through a particular city. But what Field Trip GB does, it then allows you to tag pictures en route. Say you find an interesting building, you find an interesting example or something, you take a picture, you tag it to the route and so on. And then the students go off and use that in presentation. That's one of the simplest tools that we have, in addition to a lot of tools on the 3D modeling of buildings, of objects that architects use as well. There's the space syntax map that you saw, simply produced by people standing around the corner with people counters. And then that data is modeled on an app, and then you produce maps of, say, where the major people traffic flows are in cities. And then you can plan routes. You can then guide the people in a certain direction. So it's useful for professionals. It's useful for students. A lot of the work that you see in places like London around Trafalgar Square, which was recently pedestrianized, was modeled using space syntax data. So once you knew where the people were, you can then actually create the pedestrian spaces for them to use. So it's certainly changing the profession. It's changing the way cities look, and it's changing the way students learn. So it works on multiple fronts.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? Yes, Ziad?
While in the region maybe we use bicycle less for various reasons, the cars are there and there's a lot of data generated anyway. Public companies like Google using Waze give a lot of information. Do you see a similar interest by cities to actually come up with better traffic and routing for the normal cars?
Yes, because again, cities collect, cities in the West, they collect data on traffic, on car numbers or vehicle numbers using particular routes all the time. And it comes in the form of a simple wire and a box, which is laid across the road. And every time a car goes over it, it clicks, it records the car numbers. And then you can begin to change layouts. You can begin to change the way cars enter and leave particular neighborhoods based on the numbers of cars coming from a certain direction. That's something that's been used for a long time in the UK, at least, in planning applications. Say you want to build a hotel or a big mall or a supermarket. The first thing you're asked to provide is a traffic modeling document called a transport assessment that will show how the transport will change once your building is built in a specific location. And it's that kind of data has been around for a very long time.
But this is about how many cars cross this point.
Yeah, but it also tells you where they're coming from.
A to B,
yeah.
What you're doing on the bicycle can easily be extended to
no, that's what I'm saying.
Whole route.
What you're doing on a bicycle, and you follow a whole route from end to end, and that's the important thing. You start at the origin and you end up at the destination. And you can track cars, you can track buses, you can track taxis, you can track service taxis in Amman. You can track all of these things. And as you slowly begin to map them, you begin to understand how all of these movements are happening around the city. And I think only then can you begin to try and identify integrated transport solutions, by building up that level of information. I think what the city is doing, probably falsely, under false pretenses, I think, is creating small little interventions in the infrastructure. But that doesn't help. not if you don't know where your traffic is coming from and where it's going.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions from the audience? Okay, in that case, I'd like to thank Dr. Samer Bagaeen. Thank you so much, Dr. Samer.